Hey, today we're going to talk about Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, essentially the writings portion of the Hebrew Bible. And, oftentimes in my devotional time I turn to Psalms or Job or even Proverbs, but I haven't really turned to Ecclesiastes or Song of Solomon a lot. I have a feeling a lot of you people who are church folk don't do that either. But I think there's some good things to take from it. First off, let's start talking about poetry in the Old Testament. Hebrew poetry is different than what most modern Westerns would perceive of poetry. My wife says that poems always have to rhyme. She's not the most literary of people, but bless her. Hebrew poetry essentially has two lines that either build off each other or contrast or something similar to that. It either reasserts, strengthens, or otherwise completes. Like, for example, happy are those who fear the Lord, who delight in the Lord's commandments. There's some sort of feeling of completeness or conclosure there. There's even contrast in some of these lines of Hebrew poetry. That's synonymous or synthetic or even, differentness pops up in Hebrew poetry. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, all the prophets for the most part exhibit forms of Hebrew poetry. As far as a macro view of the Psalter, Banstra's quote here on one of the slides here is very good. There's essentially the Psalms are divided up into 5 books. The first book uses Yahweh to reference the deity. Second book uses the divine name Elohim almost exclusively, and it's often been called the Elohistic Psalter. And some say it has roots in the northern kingdom of Israel, as opposed to the southern kingdom. In fact, Psalm 14 to 53, same exact psalm, except you have Yahweh used to refer to God in one psalm and Elohim used in another to refer to God, respectively. They may have been allocated. Anyway, essentially, you've got this going on that shows that there is some contrast here. Okay. Now, one thing to think about the 5 books is that 5 relates to Torah. The 5 books of the Torah, just as Moses had 5 books, so the Psalms have 5 books. And there's some later Jewish writings, Second Temple period, that almost called David a prophet. In fact, David is viewed as almost like a prophet, as some talk about the Psalms, and especially around Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, I show up a graphic of the slides there, the fivefold structure of the Psalms. I give the chapter listing there. And there's different collections within the Psalms as well, almost like a greatest hits collection, if you would. You've got the Korahite collection, dedicated to the Korahites or of the Korahites. You've got the Davidic collections there, hymns of enthronement, praise collections, Psalm 103, 107 through 107, songs of ascent. These songs of ascent probably were used in worship for the walking up to the temple. Hallelujah psalms, so on and so forth. Now, getting to the function and purpose of the Psalter, they probably were used in worship either in the temple or in simple household rituals, but they were designed to be recited, sung, performed, even meditated upon. They were essentially the worship. It's kind of summarizing, broad general statement, but in some ways they were the worship hymnal, worship book of ancient Israel. And now, as far as their Sitz im Leben, that's a German phrase for setting in life, form critics often point to this. Hymns were often used in sanctuary during annual festivals, celebrations. Community laments were often, lament psalms were often used to express the needs of the people when they met in their sanctuary in times of national calamity, according to people like Gunkel. The royal psalms expressed people's support for the king, his enthronement, or other state occasions. Individual laments were used by worshipers when they came to the sanctuary during times of personal distress, and personal thanksgivings were used when worshipers returned to the sanctuary to offer sacrifice. And it's kind of what scholars have kind of devised looking at the Psalms, looking at their different forms and genres. Just like music today have different genres, country, rock, rap, gospel, whatever, bluegrass, speed metal, whatever you subscribe to, there's different genres, and each different genre has different characteristics that make it what it is. And form critics, especially in the wake of people like Hermann Gunkel, have looked at different elements of these psalms and categorized them by quote-unquote genres. And I show you some graphics here from Gerstenberger's commentary about different genres and of Hebrew poetry, at least Psalms. And from laments, there's dirges and laments there. There's some complaint psalms, different elements that come up in the complaints. And these, I talk about the sits and Laban. They're often used to confront God with illness and bad luck, enemy struck, things like that. But they're not defeated, but they're threatened. Thanksgiving psalms. There's kind of different categories there, different elements of the psalms, the songs of praise, different elements there. Now, one thing to think about as far as the psalms go is Davidic authorship. Now, a lot of these psalms are attributed to David, but a good number aren't. There's even psalms attributed to Moses. So the question is, there's a Hebrew phrase, the name David with a lamed on the front, like a squiggly-looking line there, which, by the way, you read Hebrew left to right. Right to left, not left to right, sorry. The La, David, appears in a lot of these psalms. Is it dedication to David? Did David write these? And that's part of the question. More than likely, these psalms may not have been written down by David. Some may not. But just because it says to David or by David or for David, that lamed, however one talks about that, it may be in dedication to him in his memory, even though it may not be written by him. In fact, without the kind of hint in Psalm 51 of the Psalm of David and kind of giving some narrative context, if you didn't have a heading at the beginning of Psalm 51, you could see no connection with David, really. But that narrative intro in the first part of before Psalm 51 gives you that element. Now, it may have been written later by someone, that intro part connecting that psalm with David. We don't know. Something to think about, but more than likely David probably didn't write all the psalms. Now, there may be some going back to him, just like in some ways Moses probably didn't write the books of the Pentateuch, the Torah, but some of the memory, some of the oral traditions went back to him. Some things to think about in the Psalter. There's differences between the numbering of the Psalms in the Septuagint and in the Masoretic or Hebrew text. And I give you a list there. And there's an additional Psalm, Psalm 151 in the book of Psalms. Now, as far as key Psalms, Psalm 1 and 2 especially are often viewed as being like prefaces to the Psalter, interpretive lenses through which to view the Psalter. As a preference to the Psalter, Psalm 1 introduces the themes that culminate in the praise at the end of the book 5. It's the door to opening up the rest of the Psalms. There's the happy or blessed state of those in Psalm 1 there. Blessed are those, or happy are those who follow God and those who don't. It's a Torah psalm. It shows the Torah, by the way, is not just law, but it's also this notion of teachings, following the teachings of God. Psalm 2 is another one of those psalms that is often viewed as a preface. I can't even get the word out tonight, and it brings up some of the key themes, and I've got some good notes there from Schaeffer's commentary about the ancient worship setting of Psalm 2. Now, getting back to Psalm 51, without the heading in the NRSV where it says a Psalm of David when the prophet Nathan came to him after he'd gone into Bathsheba, Psalm 2 could be read differently or interpreted differently. Without the heading, Psalm 51 could be read differently. In fact, Psalm 51:18 could lead somebody to think the psalm was written in conjunction with the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. Schaeffer has some good thoughts there. So some features of Psalm 51 was composed during or after the exile and used in Israel as a penitential prayer. Its language and thought are connected with that of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah 40 through 66. It resonates with the promises of a new heart and new spirit from Jeremiah and Ezekiel. In this exilic context, some of the prayer's difficult points make theological sense, and the reference to the reconstruction of the city's demolished walls and restitution of the temple worship, a resituation, of the temple worship form, an appropriate conclusion. In any event, the idea of rebuilding Jerusalem has been transposed from a literal to a metaphorical sense, and that's, I think he has something there, whether you agree with it or not, but I think there's something there that just because it bears a dedication to David or David's name somewhere in the psalm doesn't mean necessarily it was written by him. That someone later on may have come and said, this is inspired by David, or this is in dedication to David. Now, talking about Proverbs, Barry Banstra, his summary there of Proverbs is really good. I think there's two main parts. Proverbs 1 through 9 is a really good notion of separation there. In chapters 10 to 31 is another section there. And Proverbs are essentially practical wisdom in some ways. In fact, wisdom is personified as lady wisdom in some ways, Sophia, Hakma type thing in Proverbs, using the Hebrew and the Greek there. Proverbs are, observations. They're given to instruct. That, they may have been situational or pragmatic. Although Proverbs are phrased universal, they don't need to be applied to every event. There needs to be discernment. In fact, there's some Proverbs that almost contradict each other. It's practical wisdom that one with wisdom and insight can apply, right? Ecclesiastes or qoheleth. There's really there's a lot of debate over the overall structure of the work or lack thereof. But one kind of consensus is that one of the main themes is the vanity of vanities, all is vanity in chapter 1, 2, and 12:8. That there seems to be this notion of the fleetingness of life, that things are vain, that it's almost like a very existential. And if you're kind of a person my age, you might have heard the genre of emo rock. Kind of the emotional, I don't care about today, mopey. Yeah. I mean, Ecclesiastes is the emo rock of the Bible. I've said it. There you go. If you get the reference, good. If you don't, then sorry. But anyway, there's this notion of the fleetingness of life. And it kind of the thing about the Hebrew Bible is there's some parts that counterbalance the other. You've got all this upbeat stuff about God and His providence in the Hebrew Bible, and you got things like Ecclesiastes that show you life is pretty much fleeting and vanishing. That life, there's things about life that just don't last. There's kind of this tension going on, and we'll find that again in a minute in Job. But before we get to Job, Song of Solomon, often also known as Canticles or Song of Songs, it's a collection of love poems. In English Bibles, it's interesting, some of the language there. And there's some ancient Near Eastern parallels in this love language, this erotic language in some ways. And yeah, I said erotic. Oftentimes, Song of Solomon has been kind of excused away as being a metaphor between God and His people, whether it be the Jewish people or God and His church, the Christians. But essentially, this is a love poem. That's what it is. It's not. It was. One layer of interpretation is not just simply a metaphor. It is actual love story between a man and a woman. And I think something good to take away from that is that love is important. A love between a man and a woman is very important, and especially in a marriage situation, it's very, very important. The thing is that in the ancient Near East and even in the Greco-Roman world, for the most part, marriage wasn't about love. It was about property exchange. And the Hebrew Bible, I think, is in the Old Testament is different, that there is this notion of love in some ways in marriage. But some of the metaphors for love, I thought I'd include them on the slides there. It's a quote from Dobbs Alsop. Love is like the finest wine, only better. A reference to 1:2, 1:4, and 4:10. Like a wonderful if debilitating sickness in chapter 2 and 5. Like a spring in chapter 2. Like a garden of delights in 4 and 5 and 7. Beyond all wealth in chapter 8 and 11 and 12. And so on and so forth. Different ways of describing love. And I included the little slide about the flock of goats. In the failed pickup line, your hair's like a flock of goats. Yeah, I mean, these notions are culturally bound. And I include a slide in there from Otmar Kiel's commentary on Song of Songs, where he talks about and fleshes out this notion of a flock of goats in the context. The simile like a flock of goats strengthens association already present in the Hebrew Bible, connotations of hair. The notion of a herd emphasizes the aspect of large numbers, too large to count, along with the dark color. Goats characterized for their impertinence and prudence. I mean, this is good qualities. I mean, this is a compliment back in those days. It's a bit of a, and I include a slide in there, aren't you glad it's a bunch of metaphors? Back in those days, that was a way of saying, hey, baby, you're very good looking, or you're hot, Back then, hot may have meant for them just simply you're angry. or your temperature is really hot. But today we talk about someone who's very attractive as being hot. Different language for different times and different places. Now the book of Job, and one of the things I talked about, mentioned briefly earlier in this lecture, is the notion that the Hebrew Bible, there's contrast. The Dramistic history, we saw that there's a notion of you're obedient, God blesses you, you're disobedient, God curses you. We find a contrast or counter-testimony, as Walter Brueggemann calls it, in the book of Job, in that Job is faithful throughout the work, but still, a world of hurt happens to him. Loses his family, loses his wealth, loses his wife, his health. In fact, his wife tells him to curse God and die. And it's all because of a wager between God and this figure, the Hasatan, this part of the heavenly council, this tempter figure, this devil's advocate. And this is Job is one of the few places in the Hebrew Bible where the word Satan, Satan, appears. And don't think person in red with pointy horns. The way that Satan is described, or this Satan, the adversary, is described in the Old Testament as more of an accusing attorney, someone bringing charges against someone in court, as much as it is somebody tempting someone. Bannister gives a really good summary of the book of Job there, and notion of its the prose and the folklore. And I include a slide of how people have interpreted the tormenting of Job there. The figure of God and Satan in the Old Testament, I've got a slide there on that. The different portrayals of God in the book pose a serious, important interpretive challenge. The Satan, this adversary, incites presumably sovereign God to inflict Job with undeserving suffering. What does it say about God? One of the issues is the notion of theodicy in the book of Job. This notion of, is God just? If all this bad stuff's happening, then what does it say about God? In the end, Job's asking for answers throughout the whole of Job. And at the end, pretty much God says, hey, big boy, I'm God and you're not. There's no answer really given there. And it's, whereas everything's all lined out neatly in the Dramistic history, and that notion of good happens to good people, bad happens to bad people. Job is that questioning comment of, well, not really. Sometimes we just don't know. Job never found out. Now, of course, the ending of Job, he gets everything back in return. Some scholars question whether that's original or not. We don't know. But essentially, all this, pardon my language, crap storm happens to Job. And in the story, in some ways, counter-testimony in the sense that it's saying, hey, sometimes bad things happen. And we don't know. And a Christian response would be, and sometimes in this side of glory, we don't know. God doesn't always send everything to happen to us. God may allow things to happen to us that are bad. I kind of jokingly think, and popped in my head the notion of, life gives you lemon, make lemonade. And I usually say, life gives you lemons, take lemons and throw them back at life. But bad things do happen, right? Now to the figure of Satan on the end of this slide here, a figure of the Satan or Satan in the book of Job. It pops up in one other place, or actually two other places in the Old Testament. In fact, we found earlier in some of the other lectures that in Chronicles, the chronicler puts that Satan, or this Satan figure, a Satan, the accuser, prompts David to take a census and calls him to sin, whereas in Samuel, David is prompted by God to take this census. Again, this figure is essentially a part of the heavenly court, almost like borrowing some of the notion of the other gods, of the deities, other cultures, this pantheon of lesser beings under the God. And these lesser beings, and one of them is Satan. It seems to be his job is to accuse, to find fault, to poke at the wounds, so to speak. It's interesting. Now, the figure, this notion of a devil or a Satan, a figure as a name, Satan, it's not very prevalent in the Old Testament. And a lot of the development of this light and dark, Satan be the dark, evil, and God being the light, good, comes out of Zoroastrianism from Persia. And you find it in some of the later writings, this growing emphasis on this figure, an evil figure. And as that notion develops and influenced by the interaction of other cultures, we find the notion of a Satan, devil type figure, a diablos in the Greek, um, in the New Testament. It's one of those notions that you don't find in the earliest parts of the Old Testament. It developed over time. Now, I do believe that there is a devil. I do believe there's a Satan. But the notion that we have today is more influenced by the New Testament and interpretations and drawings and Bugs Bunny cartoons and people in red suits and horns poking with a poker than it is in what we find in the Old Testament. But something to think about, something to chew on. Thank you.